Ugh, moving is hell, I groaned, and collapsed onto the couch that my buddy Matt and I had just carried up 4 flights of stairs. Matt, not trusting the sagging sofa to support his weight, leaned against the wall and cracked open a beer. "No, man," he laughed. "Hell is new neighbors. Cheers." I understood how he felt. In Matt's last apartment, the man next door was a hoarder, whose bags of rotting trash attracted cockroaches and spiders the size of my hand. After he got a better job and moved to suburbia, the housewife across the street began reporting him to the HOA for everything from the length of his grass to the color of his shed. It was my first day in my new apartment, and I hoped that I would have better luck. The building was a gray, dingy structure that seemed to have been stuffed between 2 nicer buildings as an afterthought. There was only one apartment on either side of it, with a narrow stairwell and a courtyard in the middle. It was a weird feeling, being able to look across into my neighbors' kitchens. But then again, if the place was nicer, I never would have been able to afford it. We polished off a 6-pack and Matt headed out, leaving me alone in my empire of cardboard boxes and empty shelves. I was exhausted from the day, and unpacked only what was necessary to take a shower, get online, and climb into bed. There was activity on the other side of the courtyard. Lights, movement, a man frying something and singing in a foreign language. Only the apartment directly across from me remained gloomy and silent. I found myself looking across the courtyard more and more. While I did the dishes or folded laundry, I wondered about the apartment facing mine. Was it vacant or something? It didn't seem to be. There was always a dark shape on the other side of its frosted glass window. The residual light from the other units made that shape cast strange shadows. Sometimes it even appeared to have moved, but I was pretty sure it was only a tall stack of trash. On the 3rd day, while I was preparing a midnight snack, I noticed the hair on the back of my neck standing up. No lights were on in any of the other apartments, but still I felt sure I was being watched. I had just turned the stovetop on when a pale hand reached out of the window across from mine and slid it open. "You're new here, aren't you, dear?" With her gray hair tied up in a bun and her worn apron, the woman reminded me of a thinner, sadder version of my grandmother. It took me a moment to recover from the shock and reply to her. Yeah, my name's Corey. I just moved in." "I'm Meline. It's a pleasure to meet you." I looked for something to say to fill the awkward silence. I actually thought that apartment was vacant." "Oh no," Meline laughed. "My daughter Ellen and I have lived here for years. She just doesn't like me to use the electricity very much. Everything's just so expensive these days." "Right?" I glanced over at the toast I'd been making, which was starting to burn. "Well, I better get going. I'll see you around." "Goodbye." Meline waved and slid the window shut, but her silhouette remained in place on the other side of the frosted glass. She was what I had been seeing all along. Did she just sit there all the time? With a shudder, I slid my own window shut and retreated to bed with my snack. Even after I'd eaten, read for a few minutes, and turned out the light, I couldn't calm down. I kept thinking about Meline sitting in the dark on the other side of the courtyard, like a spider at the center of its web. Watching, listening, waiting. In my bright kitchen the next morning, all that fear felt silly, until the doorbell rang. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I set down my coffee mug and peered out the peephole. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't a short Italian guy in a tuxedo holding a box of cookies. Francisco lived in the top apartment across the courtyard from me. He was the maitre d' of a fancy restaurant downtown, and hoped to open his own catering business one day. It was his cooking and singing that I had noticed during my first night in the complex. I thanked him for the care package, but he had left before I thought to ask him about Meline. I was late for work anyways, and barely had time to chug down the rest of my coffee before running out the door. I'm not sure when or how my kitchen window slipped open, but several days had passed before I noticed it. I wanted to believe that it was just the faulty construction of the place, but when I closed my eyes, I imagined that old woman's pale fingers stretching to a hideous length as they reached out to re-establish the connection between us. "Good evening, dear." I jumped at the sudden voice. It was Meline. Of course it was. Sitting in the same place where she'd been when I talked to her last. "You're looking handsome this evening." "Thanks," I blushed. "I got a date." I wasn't sure why I was telling my elderly neighbor about all this. Maybe it was just because the shirt and pants were new, and it felt nice to hear them complimented. "You ought to cook her something. There's this one recipe that's always worked wonders for me." I honestly hadn't been sure what to do for dinner, and I was grateful for the advice. Despite the unusual ingredients and odd cooking times, it turned out to be just as delicious as it had sounded, and the date was definitely a success. Maybe I had misjudged Meline. What if she spent all her time sitting on the other side of the window because she had nowhere else to go? We began talking every day after that. Our conversations were never long, but she always seemed to look forward to them. When I asked her what she thought of the neighborhood, however, she said something that made my jaw drop. "Oh, I don't know, dear. My daughter doesn't let me out much." Before I could ask what she meant, my phone buzzed. It was work, with a call I couldn't afford to miss. By the time I was finished, Meline was gone from her place by the window. The reason for my move was actually to be closer to my job. I had just begun my first year of residency at a children's hospital, and as the newest member of the team, I was called in to cover shifts more than anyone else. After 2 grueling back-to-back doubles, I forgot all about Madeline's odd comment, at least until later, when it took on a horrible significance. Mad and my other friends often asked why I was putting myself through so much just to work in a second-rate children's hospital. Like them, I was a single guy in my 20s without a drop of maternal instinct. I had gotten into medicine hoping to become some sort of researcher or well-paid surgeon, but as cliche as it sounds, I soon discovered that I just loved kids. For every moment of fun or laughter I had at work, however, there were 10 more moments of tragedy. I was assigned to the terminal care unit, and the majority of the children I worked with weren't expected to leave the hospital alive. Some knew, some didn't. Some begged me with big, pleading eyes to tell them the truth, or to save them somehow. I left work physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. There were things at home that should have stood out to me that I failed to notice. Important details that I overlooked. Like my first interaction with Madeline's daughter, Ellen. Unless I was coming off a double shift, Ellen and I never coincided. Our schedules, it seemed, were just too different. When I saw her for the first time, I thought she was somebody's guest, until I realized she was walking toward the apartment across from me with keys in her hand. Like her mother, she was tall, with feathery hair and sharp features. She looked to be in her mid-40s. "Hey," I waved. "I'm Corey. I live across the hall. I don't think we met. You're Ellen, right?" Yes, that's me," Ellen responded carefully. The suspicion on her face wasn't surprising. Between the stubble on my face and the dark circles under my eyes, I must have looked like some kind of drug addict. "I'm just getting off work." I tried to smile. "I'm doing my residency at the hospital, so I keep some pretty odd hours. I hope I don't wake you two when I get back." No, you don't wake me up. I hardly ever go into the backside of the apartment anyway. Too many bad memories." She shut her eyes, like the very thought of it was painful. "See you around, I guess." Ellen opened the door just enough for her to slip through, then slammed it shut. I heard at least 2 or 3 locks clicking into place. Why had she been staring at me so strangely? I had been friendly enough, hadn't I? Maybe I should have mentioned that I hadn't been stalking her. It was her mother who had told me her name. Too tired to care anymore, I collapsed onto the couch and fell immediately into a dreamless sleep. 1 a.m. found me in the kitchen, pouring myself a bowl of cereal for... what? Dinner? Breakfast? Maybe it didn't matter. Glancing out the window, I was surprised to see Meline in her usual spot. She looked up at me and smiled. "I ran into your daughter today," I told her. "Oh, I'm sorry for you then." Meline laughed and grinned. "Ellen doesn't like to socialize with other people like I do, you know?" I mumbled something about how Ellen seemed nice enough, but my elderly neighbor just waved it off. We never got along, Ellen and I. Sometimes I wonder whether something slipped in and stole my daughter's skin." Meline seemed to think that idea was outrageously funny, but the phrase sent a shiver up my spine. I mumbled something about how I needed to be getting to bed, but as I left the kitchen, I could still hear her cackling in the dark. "Sometimes I wonder whether something slipped in and stole my daughter's skin." I turned those words over and over in my mind as I struggled to fall asleep. In my nightmares, I saw Meline sitting in her chair by the window with her daughter's severed head in her lap. She was knitting a scarf from Ellen's blood-matted hair, and as she hummed, it coiled up like a snake, slithered through my window and wrapped around my neck, tightening until I couldn't breathe. I awoke panting and tangled in the sheets, with a cool breeze blowing across my face. I stormed into the kitchen and slammed the window shut. For 4 days, I kept it closed. I was so busy with work that I was hardly ever home anyway. But by the 4th day, I was missing my chats with Meline. And that wasn't all. My date Laura was coming over again, and she was excited to have something like what you cooked last time. I needed another one of Medeline's recipes. It took a while for Meline to reappear, but when she did, she had exactly what I needed. An idea for a slow-cooked stew that would be perfect for the cooler, damper weather. She also suggested that I turn my sofa toward the street-facing window, so that my date and I could watch the rain together. "This is so cozy," Laura told me afterwards, curling up against my chest and watching the storm wash over the streets outside. "How did you know that I always wanted to spend a night like this?" I decided it was a bad idea to give the credit to the old lady next door. After another double shift, I ran into Ellen for a second time. She was just as skittish as before. When I called her name, she spun like someone had struck her. "Hey, neighbor," I smiled. "I wanted to ask you something. Your mother—" "Listen, guy," Ellen cut me off. "I don't know you at all, and you've got no business talking to me about my mother. I don't care what you've heard about us." I didn't mean... I tried again. "Leave me alone." Ellen backed into her apartment and slammed the door. I sensed her hesitating on the other side, no doubt ready to call the police if I approached. I blinked, shrugged, and went into my own apartment. What else could I do? If Ellen thought I was a creep, she had every right not to talk to me. But that didn't mean I had to stop interacting with her mother. I had meant to thank Meline myself, but life kept getting in the way. It started with a boy named Carter. Carter was only 8 years old. He was dying, and unlike a lot of patients in the terminal ward of the children's hospital, he knew it. I'm not sure how I would handle that news myself, but Carter apparently had decided to spend his final days watching cartoons and making bracelets for the kids in his class. "So they'll have something to remember me by," he said. Also, unlike a lot of other patients, Carter was a ward of the state. He didn't have family coming in and out with giant teddy bears and his favorite snacks. Seeing him there, bent over his hospital blankets, biting his tongue while he strung beads onto yet another bracelet, nearly broke my heart. Even though it was against regulations, I started spending more and more time with the kid. He clearly appreciated the company. Once, when Carter was in a more serious mood, I asked him if he was afraid of dying. He touched the side where the cancer was worst. "Only when it hurts," he said. That afternoon, he gave me a bracelet of my own. I took it with gratitude, even if it wasn't exactly my style. "I know you don't like red and yellow together, but that's how it has to be. These colors in this order," Carter explained. "Why's that?" I wondered how he knew I hated that combination. "You got a shadow over you," Carter shrugged. I was about to ask him what he meant when all the machines beside him started going off at once. Carter fell in his bed, convulsing. I was off the clock and wasn't even supposed to be in his room, but I ran to the nurse's station anyway, desperate to get help for this boy who meant so much to me. The team arrived in time to stabilize him, but I wasn't allowed to remain at his side. When I went into work the next morning, I expected to find a new patient in Carter's room. The staff had probably rolled his body out overnight, and with such a high demand for space, a new child would have been put up there, unaware that a corpse had occupied her space only minutes before. I knocked on the door reluctantly and backed my medical card inside, so I wouldn't have to look until the last minute. Bet you didn't think I'd make it, huh? Carter was sitting up in bed with a big grin. I hope my sigh of relief wasn't too obvious. Since he seemed awake and happy, I asked him what he had meant with that bizarre, "you've got a shadow on you" comment. Carter looked confused. He had no idea what I was talking about. Outside of work, things with Laura were getting more serious. Winter holidays were coming up, and I wanted to invite her back to my hometown to meet my family. The next time I saw Meline, I asked her if she had any suggestions for a romantic dinner. "I do," she smiled, "but this one is a bit more complicated. Are you sure you're up to it?" "Try me," I laughed, until I heard the list of ingredients. The Chinese grocery store 3 blocks over had half of what I needed. For the rest, I had to go to an herbalist. When she handed over a particularly sinister-looking bag of gray leaves, I couldn't help but ask what it was used for. "Flavoring liquors, mostly," the hipster girl behind the register replied, with a wink that I didn't understand until much later. "I know how it looks, but it's actually beneficial in small doses." Despite her reassurances, I was skeptical, and I made a point to taste Madeline's recipe myself several hours before my date was due to arrive. It tasted incredible, and the only lingering effect I noticed was how much I wanted to lift the lid off the pot and eat some more of it. My date arrived right on time, bringing with her the bottle of red wine that Meline had suggested that would go well with our meal. There was no rain to watch out the window that night, but with such good food and such good company, who needed anything else? A little while after I went back to the kitchen for seconds, we both started feeling drowsy. The wine was half gone, and we both had a long week at work. But it was more than that. My arms and legs felt like they were weighted down with lead. I looked over at my date. There was something important that I needed to tell her or ask her, but I couldn't remember what. It was easier just to lay my head back and close my eyes. I have no way of knowing whether what I experienced that night was real, or just a hallucination brought on by the poisoning, but it felt real to me. When my eyes opened, the digital clock read 4:14 a.m. My arms and legs were still numb, and my mouth felt like it had been stuffed with cotton. Laura was snoring softly on the pillow across from me, her limbs bent strangely, like a broken doll. The streetlights outside lit the room with a dead yellow glow. If my head had fallen backwards at a different angle, I might never have seen the dark shape that came crawling through my kitchen window. At first, I thought it was smoke from a fire somewhere, but I didn't smell anything burning. Only a stale, rotten odor, like some long-dead frozen thing finally beginning to thaw. The room, too, had gotten colder. It crept across the ceiling, bending its head around backwards to stare down at us. I couldn't run, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare up in horror as its neck stretched downward toward me. Its mouth opened wide. It hesitated. Its wide, pale eyes locked on the bracelet around my wrist. Coiling like a snake, it plunged its teeth into Laura's neck instead. As it drank her life force, its monstrous features began to change. My neighbor Meline was older than I thought, I realized. Older and far hungrier than any living thing could ever be. By the time she finished her feast, she looked even younger than I was, but thin and horribly stretched. My date, on the other hand, was pale as candle wax. I knew that I should do something, that I should call for help somehow, but just thinking about the effort was too much for me. My eyes closed and I slipped back into sleep. When Laura and I awoke, we had slept more than 24 hours. Flies buzzed over the half-finished portions of stew on the coffee table in front of us. The reek of the wine, the spoiling meat, and the stuffy room made me sick. I lurched to the bathroom and vomited up everything I'd eaten the night before. When I finally got back to the couch, Laura was already getting unsteadily to her feet. It was uncomfortably warm in the apartment, but she was shivering. She didn't come right out and say, "You drugged me," but the accusation was clear in her eyes. Laura refused to let me help her put on her coat, and after muttering a harsh "bye," she stumbled out into the hallway. Watching through the peephole, I noticed that she had to lean against the wall just to walk. I chugged water until I felt like a human being again, then went immediately to my computer to research the recipe Meline had given me. The herbs the recipe had called for were all different, and in such small quantities that I hadn't thought twice about including them. I hadn't realized that all of them contained high quantities of thujone and 2 other compounds I had never heard of. All 3 had properties that could be amplified by alcohol. Meline knew that I wouldn't be able to get all the ingredients in one place, so no one could warn me about the effects of combining them all. She also must have known that the strong spices in the recipe would mask their bitter taste, and that the full effects wouldn't be clear until the meal was taken with wine. That was what the herbalist had meant with her wink and that comment about flavoring liquors. The damage was already done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw visions of that thing crawling across the ceiling. Laura now thought the worst of me, and I had the worst hangover of my life. There were no lights on in Ellen and Madeline's apartment, and for the first time since my neighbor and I had begun to chat, the window across the courtyard was closed. Against my better judgment, I staggered across the hallway to demand an explanation. The effort of walking even a short distance made the floor tilt like a ship in a storm. By the time I had finished knocking, a cold sweat was dripping down my forehead. I didn't have the strength for this, I realized. And if that thing was waiting on the other side, I was afraid that I might lose my mind completely. No one answered. And before I crawled back into bed, I double-locked my own door and nailed my kitchen window shut. When I stumbled into work the next morning, I was still feeling weak and feverish. So much so that I almost forgot to stop by Carter's room before my shift. The shades were closed. The machines indicated that the boys' heartbeats were stable, but there was far too much time between them. Carter was unconscious. A series of unfinished bracelets lay on the table beside him. Even though I was running late, I sat down for a minute to hold his hand. Carter's eyes snapped open. "That shadow's gone." He smiled without seeing. Then his expression darkened. "It's taken somebody else now. Somebody close to you." Laura. I had called and messaged her so many times since the night before, but I suddenly realized that I should have done more. Carter's grip on my hand loosened and his face turned away. He had slipped back into unconsciousness. I backed out of the room and called emergency services. A girl who I'd had a date with the night before was acting strange, I explained, and I had reason to believe that she might have hurt herself or others. Could they send some officers by her home to perform a wellness check? I kept the details vague, leaving out any reference to poisoned meals or nightmares crawling on the ceiling, and the operator seemed to believe me. I didn't know for sure, however, until a pair of officers came by my apartment that evening. Those 2 blue uniforms looked like the end of my days as a free man. I was going to prison for murder, and the life that I had worked so hard to build was going to slip through my fingers like sand. If the officers noticed that I was on the edge of a nervous breakdown, they didn't show it. They didn't cuff me, read my rights, or ask to search my apartment. They just asked a couple standard questions about Laura and took some notes. Then they gave me the bad news. No wellness check was ever made on Laura, because by the time I called, she was already in the city morgue. The cause of death appeared to be natural, the officer informed me, and he was sorry for my loss. I should have been relieved that I wasn't a suspect, but all I could feel was guilt, and a growing sense of dread. Without realizing it, the officers had confirmed what Carson had warned me about. They had confirmed that Meline was involved in my date's death. The sun had set, and the officers were preparing to leave. For all I knew, as soon as I was alone, I would hear an awful scratching sound from my kitchen window. I looked down at the bracelet on my wrist. Did it mean I was protected somehow? I was feeling stronger. Maybe it was time to risk another confrontation. I pried the nails free and looked across the courtyard, but Madeline's apartment was still dark. I crossed the hallway, rang the bell, and pounded on the door. When there was no answer, I knocked even louder. Eventually, Francisco, my upstairs neighbor, stuck his head out into the staircase. "If you're trying to reach Ellen, you're not going to get her that way. Poor girl's skittish," he whispered. "But I understand why." "Understand why? What do you mean?" I asked. "Her mother, Madeline. I never met such a cruel and domineering woman. When we were kids, we used to joke that she was a witch. Even in her old age, she never gave her daughter any peace. After Madeline got dementia, Ellen wound up being her full-time live-in caregiver. I don't know how she lasted, until that miserable old bat died last year." "Sorry, what?" Even after Francisco repeated himself, I still couldn't believe it. "Madeline died last year? Are you sure?" "Well, it was a closed casket funeral. I didn't stab a stake into her heart, but I'd say so." My upstairs neighbor laughed and gave me an odd look. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a..." I slammed the door before he could say it. The obituary, the death certificate I found online, the grave plot in a nearby cemetery, none of it was enough to change my mind. I knew that something had lingered on in that apartment with Ellen, waiting for its chance, its second lease on life, and that it had used me to get it. I couldn't bring myself to spend another night in that building. I told Matt that my heater was broken as an excuse to sleep on his couch, and I checked in on Carter every day at work. His doctors weren't optimistic about his chances. Most of them had already written the 8-year-old off as a lost cause. Every time I passed his room, I glanced down at the bracelet he had given me, the one that had somehow saved my life. What was it he had said? "It has to be these colors, in this order." That gave me an idea. An idea that I would be mad to try, but I was running out of options. Unless I wanted to break my lease, become homeless, and lose all of my possessions, eventually I was going to have to go back and face my fears. When I did, I wanted to be prepared. The first thing I noticed was the smell. A putrid, decaying odor like a beach at low tide. It hit me like a wall as soon as I approached my door, and the thought of what it might mean made my hand tremble as I unlocked my own front door. I switched on the lights, ready for anything. But the place was just how I'd left it. I checked each room, but there were no horrors hiding in the closet, behind the shower curtain, or under the bed. The smell, I realized, was coming from across the hall. From Ellen and Madeline's apartment. I went upstairs and explained the situation to Francisco, who had also noticed the reek from the apartment below. "You know, Ellen gave me a spare key a few years ago. She said only to use it if something happened to her and I needed to take care of her mother, which, thank God, I never had to do. I'd forgotten all about it. Wait here." There was doubt on Francisco's face when he returned. "Here it is. But are you sure you want to do this?" "Doesn't look like I have much choice," I responded. The key, so similar to my own, felt foreign and dangerous in my hand. I walked downstairs and knocked on my neighbor's door for the third time. After a long wait, I turned the key in the unfamiliar lock and went inside. The lights didn't work, but even in the gloom I could see that the apartment had been well cared for. Once. Now it looked like a bunch of high school kids had thrown a week-long party in the place. Half-eaten food, bottles of booze, and cast-off clothing covered the old-fashioned furniture. But what stood out most to me was a disturbingly human-looking shape slumped over in one of the kitchen chairs. I shook my phone's flashlight, and recognized that long, feathery hair right away. It was Ellen. Her skin was bluish and bloated, and there were bruise marks in the shape of long, thin fingers around her neck. She had been dead for days, if not longer. I was about to back out the door when something dropped onto me from above. It was like being ambushed by a particularly huge and horrible spider. Madeline's limbs were too long, with far too many joints, and they coiled around me with ease. Her needle-like teeth snapped at my neck. If it wasn't for the idea that Carter had given me, I would have been just another feast for her. I had noted the pattern in the bracelet he had made for me, and repeated it, creating something that was longer, stronger, and more like a collar. I slipped it over Madeline's head just as she pinned me to the floor. "What do you think would happen if I tightened this?" I grunted. My neighbor froze. Her teeth and joints retracted, snapping sickeningly back into her body until she was indistinguishable from any other ordinary young woman. Her eyes, however, were ancient and cruel. She blinked defiantly at me. "What is it that you want, dear?" Madeline hissed. "Come with me and I'll show you." We left after dark, with my hand on Madeline's shoulder to hide the fact that I was holding the supernatural noose that I had made tightly around her throat. She accepted my directions with eerie calm, which made me think that she had outwitted traps like this before. Traps set by other clever people like me, who stupidly thought that they were a match for her. I didn't understand how this was working or why. I just hoped that I could hide that fact until I could do what needed to be done. I held my breath as we walked into the hospital and took the elevator up to Carter's room. The machines were still beeping softly. There had been no change in the boy's condition. If you can drain a person's life force, there's got to be a way you can put it back. "This is ridiculous." Madeline glared at me. I tightened the collar. "Give him half. Half of what you took from Laura. Do that, and I'll let you go. You have my word." Madeline sighed. She bent low and sank her fangs into Carter's neck. I noticed the change almost immediately. Madeline's hair graying, wrinkles reforming on her perfect skin. Carter's pulse speeding up, the color returning to his cheeks. By the time she had finished, she looked to be in her 40s instead of her 20s. And Carter was waking up. I looked at Madeline and shuddered. Even without her youth, she was beautiful. At least, for anyone who didn't know the truth about what was behind the mask. Carter looked up at us, confusedly trying to take the tube out of his arm. I could hear the running footsteps of nurses outside. "Your word is your bond," Madeline sneered, her teeth stained red. "And I'm holding you to it." Her collar snapped and she was gone, disappearing like smoke into the ventilation shaft. Now that I knew her secret, there was no way she was going to come back to our building. She was going out there, into the world, out to hunt for more victims. "That was your shadow." Carter's jaw dropped. "What was it doing in my room?" Gruff doctors pushed me aside, telling me that I wasn't on duty and that I wasn't supposed to be here. But I kept a grip on Carter's hand. "It's a long story." I smiled. "I'll tell you when you're feeling better." Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.